how I like to position myself and our role in the industry is I think we are strategic advisors for the senior leadership team. We are storytellers, building that relationship between the organization and its schools and its communities. I think we are kind of brand ambassadors. We are promoting one organization in Ontario. There are 4 publicly funded school districts. So we are, you're telling the stories and promoting the brand of one organization over the other 3. And there are lots of crises that happen in school districts, surprisingly, and people don't realize that. So we are crisis managers as well.
About the time that I became involved with educational technology was another sort of phenomenon was happening in school districts across the world, and that was the advent of communications personnel. And it may have been that some of the very large districts had that already, but not most school districts. That wasn't a thing. We didn't really feel the need to have that. I mean, you had newsletters, like how much communication were you doing? But of course, with the advent of social media as well, this became a really important thing, not only to share information, but to be storytellers, as you heard Ryan say. So today's guest, Ryan Strang, is the Senior Manager of Communications and Community Relations for the Grand Erie District School Board in Ontario. And he's also the president of CASE, which is the Canadian Association of Communication Experts in Canada. I don't know if the last E is experts, but I'm not going to correct it now. A communications person at this point would edit this video and properly give you that last one, but that's not who I am. But anyway, what a great conversation. I got to know Ryan probably about 7 years ago. I spoke at their annual conference, and he has continued along his journey in various school districts, as well as some corporations outside of education, and just brings a really solid foundation of like, why do we have this role? Why is this so important? And my first question to him, as you'll hear, is like, how does this go beyond just telling what's happening? That seems like the simplistic way of looking at it. But as you hear from Ryan's conversation, there's a lot more to it than that. And it's fascinating to see the evolution of it and the considerations that they have, and as well as being part of a strategic team and not just an afterthought, but really being thoughtful in how things are communicated. It's my great pleasure for my last episode of this season. We'll take a little summer hiatus, but for the last episode of this season, it's my pleasure to welcome Ryan Strang. So Ryan, for those people who are not watching this, they may not have the clue that I have when I look at the background. So tell us where you are in the world today and what you do in that world.
Yeah, so some people might see a poster of the Brantford Civic Center, the arena, the hockey arena here for the minor hockey team of the OHL Brantford Bulldogs, or you might see a cutoff logo. Some people might also think I'm in Wisconsin, where the Green Bay Packers play. And then there's a poster of old Iverwin Stadium in Hamilton. All 3, which represent, I'm a huge sports guy, live and love Hamilton, Ontario. But have the great pleasure of working for the Grand Erie District School Board in Brantford, Ontario.
And how'd you get there?
I drove this morning. I drove down the busy 403. No, how I got to Grand Erie is I've been here since July 2024, and it was my 3rd stop in school communications. I spent about 10 years at the Peel District School Board, a small stop at the Waterloo Region District School Board, and then a few other stops in the private and nonprofit sector, but ultimately have landed here recently and have loved every moment.
So, I mean, I think we want to get into sort of there is a history, there's an evolution of school communications that I have experienced and seen both internally and externally, and you have, even more kind of insight that. But so if somebody were to ask you, hey, Ryan, what's your job besides, obviously letting people know what's happening in the school division and so forth, like how do you sort of define the role of a school communications director personnel in school boards across Canada?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, they simply say, like, what do you do for a living? And I say, I work for a school board in communications. And they think that, I'll use the old term, but do you just tweet all day long, using X sort of thing? And the answer is no. Like that is one aspect. Social media is one aspect of our work, but it is not all I do every day. I do think the role of communications, at least in my like 12 plus years in school communications, has really evolved. I think, how I like to position myself and our role in the industry is I think we are strategic advisors for the senior leadership team. We are promoting one organization in Ontario. There are 4 publicly funded school districts. So we are, you're telling the stories and promoting the brand of one organization over the other 3. And I think there are lots of crises that happen in school districts, surprisingly, and people don't realize that. So we are crisis managers as well.
I mean, yeah, and I think people now appreciate the fact that I think sort of there's this proactive and there's this reactive side, right? Like the active, as you've kind of defined it as being, okay, here's a crisis, here's somebody's upset, worried, something bad happened, whatever that
Yeah.
crisis is, and then there's the, like as you said, the storyteller. Like we actually want to be proactive, that's the new part in my sort of in my experience, because I can just here in Saskatchewan, the small little school district that I started with in 1990s didn't even have, like, this wasn't even a role, and it wasn't until I think it was 2006 when we amalgamated that there was some sort of as a larger, I don't know if it's because they were larger or just realizing that. So when you think about kind of what about the evolution of this role, like how do you kind of what can you tell us historically about, like, what was the sort of original idea, whether maybe it's the same, maybe it's been all the
Yeah.
same, or maybe
Yeah.
it's that.
Yeah, and I think for my role, so I also have the privilege of being the executive director with the Canadian Association of Communicators in Education, which is a national association supporting communication professionals in education with a focus on K-12 education. So I get a little bit of a higher level overview of the landscape and the situation across the country, which is great to have. And just your comment about in the 90s, you didn't even have a role. I will say that is still the case in a lot of school districts across the country,
Okay.
likely smaller rural districts, but the
Right.
role of communication, whether it is tweeting all day or the school newsletter, that is a form of communications. And that is being done, potentially by a clerical staff member or a superintendent or the director of education in particular organizations. So the work is still being done. It's just might not be, it's a little bit more tactical maybe and not strategic, because it's kind of in addition to everything else they're doing. And so I think that is still the situation. And case we believe, every school district should have a communications professional to help elevate the work that they're doing, and ultimately be prepared for when things don't go well. And, not everything is positive, unfortunately. And it's kind of the classic thing that I was always told. It's not if, it's when a crisis will happen. And so having
Sure.
that expert on staff, being ready, prepared to handle that, ultimately helps with reputation, with recovery of those things. But I think from my perspective, in my kind of career journey, the industry has changed. I think, without getting into AI too much, but I think with even social media back in 2012, the introduction of Twitter and the use of Twitter initially was still one way, often. And I think communication prior to social media was one way communication. And I think that has really evolved in the last 10, 14 years to present day. And I think, the speed of communication, there used to be this idea of when crisis hits, have a holding statement, out and ready in the first hour of the crisis. Now with social media, like, you better have a statement out there to tell people you're aware and ready in the first 15 minutes, right? And so just the speed of communications has really impacted our role, the pressure of the role. And, we can get into it maybe a little bit more later, but, things like hybrid workforce has changed our work. The downsizing of traditional media and more that direct to consumer through social media and through digital
Right.
channels has really changed our focus. I think there's a lot more work or emphasis on community engagement and marketing as well in our work. And then I think, the polarization of audiences, skepticism amongst audiences and communities has definitely played a role in the evolution of this work and the importance of this work.
Well, and you and I, before we actually hit record, we were talking a little bit about, the last number of years. And I had the privilege of speaking at your conference in 2019, 7 years ago. And you told me at that time, I think you said that was the largest attended conference at the time, and you had 125 people. Just talk a little bit about the change in membership
Yeah.
in 2019. I mean, that social media had been, well launched at that point, a big part of our lives to today.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think in 2019, I think we were hovering around like 175, 180 members. That conference had 125 attendees, and I think CASE, the association, had been around at that time for about 35 years or so. And when you think about the vast, size of this country and the number of school districts in each province, like 180 people is really a small number when you think about it. And I think that number, unfortunately, in 2020, as we all know, took a hit even further with the pandemic. But really coming out of the pandemic and as people kind of return to work a little bit in a more normal capacity around 2022, I think the pandemic in our industry as communications professionals, as public health professionals in hospitals, really in all industries and all levels of work, was a bit of a wake-up call. And I think it was an eye-opener for, we need to have people who can communicate quickly, efficiently, and effectively in the moment. And I think maybe not all organizations beyond school districts had those people. And I think you saw a little bit more emphasis on the hiring of trained communications professionals to help organizations through crisis. And you're not always going to have a global pandemic every day, but the idea of having trained professionals there. I think the other piece that we noticed, and I'll get back to the association as the result of this, is, I think we started to see communications professionals having seats at the leadership table. That wasn't always the case. So not only back to an earlier comment about organizations not even having a communications person to begin with, the ones that did may not have had them at the table hearing, the discussion happening at the senior leadership table. And I think that's changed, in the last couple of years. And I do think a huge success is we kind of have that permanent seat at the table. Leadership teams for decades have had, their HR teams, their legal teams, their finance teams at the table, but not the comms team. And I think that has shifted. In terms of the positive impact to CASE, is we're now in present day at 550 members, which is a massive growth in just a very short period of time. And I think that's because people have sought out professional learning, and best practices across the industry. And that's kind of what CASE offers at a high level, is those three pieces. And we have seen our national conferences and our regional events really provide those benefits to members to go back to their school districts and really bring best practices back to their school districts to support staff and families with strategic communications. So we're very happy with the growth, both from a membership perspective, but also from a kind of a seat at the table perspective as an industry. So.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's, I think what we're definitely seeing that more, at least in the districts that I work with, that people are recognizing that we've got to be able to, whatever thing we're doing. And again, my work of late is all around AI. And so I'm interesting to see how, school boards are sort of navigating that messaging, right? Because it can be polarizing. But I want to go back a little bit, because in, those early days of social media, I was somebody who strongly advocated and saw an opportunity for, whether it was individuals, whether it was organizations and I was a little bit loath to use the word branding. I always felt that was a little bit, however, as an individual, but as an organization, there's no question, right? Like you have a brand. And up until that point, at least and maybe even still to some degree, is that I think most school associations as public entities Like they just like no news is good news. Like as long as nobody's talking bad about us, we're good. Like I mean, we're not, we're not recruiting more students. We know this, so that like it's just a different, as a public entity, it doesn't have the same kind
Yeah.
of urgency or requirement to sell yourself, right? That changed. I think that has changed over time, where people are seeing that somewhat differently. But I guess what I'm getting to is, there was always a bit of a risk aversion to, utilizing social media to try to tell the story. What story was that, and to what end? I guess I wonder about whether it was the pandemic that kind of, and all of the crisis, the existing polarization that is in the world today. I guess what I'm wondering about is, like, when you think about your role in Grand Erie or across Canada in terms of telling your story,
Yeah.
like how big a thing is, like, how important is that to continue on versus the risk management side of it?
Yeah, so I think
So
for me, it's social media is a tool in the toolbox. It's not the be all end all, to be honest. I think, just to take a step back, I think there was some aversion to adopting a new tool. There always a lot of uncertainty around the implementation of things, but I think you know it really, for the first time, created this instant two-way communication channel between the organization and your immediate stakeholders, being students and families and staff, and then potentially the outer bubble of that, right? Being prospective parents, being prospective staff members. And so it was the first time that we could instantly provide a window into the classroom or into the school space, right? Like, you drop your kids off at school at 8 a.m. and you don't pick them up for 3 p.m. And, as a relatively new parent, or as a parent of a kindergarten student myself, as a parent, that child comes home after 6 hours of being in the classroom, and you say, how was your day? What did you learn today? And they're like, oh, nothing. I don't want to talk about it. I learned nothing. And you're like, that's not possible. You were literally inside this building for 6 hours, and so social media really allowed that opportunity for that window as a parent. And I see that now with my own, and I think it provided a lot of value. And there was a bit of so while there was hesitation, I think once both communications professionals and families and staff saw the benefits, you started to see the uptake and the adoption rates really increase. But I think, I think in there was like the polarization or the hesitation around the use of social media. I think, there has been a lot of, pushback on from your communities, or just generally in society. Or, it's hard to post something, even if it's a smiling kid, that's positive. It's you're likely to still get one or more negative comments on it, right? Like, there's just
right.
a natural gravitation to turning something positive into a negative, right? And so I think there's, you know, coupled with, potential burnout and workload, and as I said, it's one tool. I think we have seen a bit of a return to that hesitation around social media. And when you look at metrics and you look at, ROI, you have to ask yourself, are you getting benefits out of it that you hope to do, or is there something else that you can redirect your attention to? And I think there are tools out there, and some being traditional and some being AI or new tools, but I think there are tools out there that can hyper target your message. And I think that's an important role of a communications professional, is they can make recommendations to target the message to the appropriate audience at the appropriate time, instead of just blasting out a tweet to your thousands of potential followers, whether they're human or not human followers.
Yeah, and obviously lots of things, and I think again you captured the idea that I think we're in a stage now where, like, it doesn't matter. You can post the greatest thing in the world, share a video that, like, how could anybody? But yeah, somebody could see why this is bad or whatever. But
Yeah.
but again, but I think the other piece that everybody understands is that when that one dissenting voice comes through, it's quite often that there's 100 times more people who didn't say anything, but actually quite enjoyed, like found it to be a positive. They just didn't say anything, right? So
Yeah.
you hear it's squeaky wheel kind of syndrome. But I also wonder about, this is a question I was always curious about is, do school districts have a unique voice? Like, to what degree do you want to be uniquely Grand Erie, or to what degree do you just want to be kind of plain Jane vanilla? Like, we don't want to try to sound like we're anything different than the school boards next to us or in another province. We are kind of keeping this very, very sterile. I don't know if sterile is the right word, but generic
Yeah.
maybe is a better
Yeah.
word. Like,
Yeah.
what degree do you think about that?
I always use the
I
word
always use the word
corporate. Like I
corporate.
want school districts or the school district that I work for to be less corporate. I think when you're on social media, I think there needs to be a certain tone and charisma maybe that needs to kind of come through. That's a little bit playful. That's different than your newsletter tone or your message from your director of education tone, right? I think there needs to be some differences delivering the same message ultimately, right? But just in a different way. And that's still professional, but less corporate, I would say it is ultimately. But I would say, I don't have the social media strategies in front of me for all of the school districts across the country. I would say there's probably a varying degree of strategies out there where I think some are very intentional to be playful and fun and
Right.
charismatic. And I think there are others out there who are just getting the message out. And then there are others to say, no, we are more serious and professional and corporate than others. And I think that I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer there. I think you
Sure.
have to, again, look back to your metrics and your analytics and say, is this message being received? And if the answer is yes, then whatever you're doing is I think is the right answer. I think the community you're serving or our communities across the country are so different. So, speaking with the communities in Brantford might look different than the ones in Hamilton, which is next door to us, or, Northern Ontario as an example, or Saskatchewan. So I think you have to take in all of those factors into consideration to develop your brand voice or your brand tone, whatever that may be. But I do think also the visual aspect of social media, right? I don't know if people, recall Twitter in its early days or MySpace or Facebook. There were no visual components to those messages, right? Like it was just you and your thoughts. It was like your internal thoughts being put out on the internet. And if you see those in your memories now, you're probably horrified a little bit. But how that evolution has changed to what are the visual components accompanying the message, right? Those are just as important. And I think it's important because we're all doom scrolling on Instagram and these various feeds, the visual to grab someone's attention is so important. And I think the professionalism of your message as a district organization ultimately says a lot about your schools and the culture in your school buildings, in your classrooms, and the reputation of you as an organization as a whole. And I think communications professionals play a critical role in establishing that kind of culture and reputation from a brand perspective.
Well, and a mutual colleague and friend of ours, Carla Pereira, was one of those people. I mean, you're smiling as I say her name because she, helped lead. And again, I don't necessarily, it wasn't all or her, although I know knowing her personality very much influenced a playfulness, a sense of playfulness when she was at Peel and you were there as well. I can remember I know I captured some of the interactions that were online and used those as examples with other people around, like, isn't this interesting? And there were some fun ones with snow days where kids were, can we call a snow day? And so there's this very unique element of a corporate brand, and we've seen these in other brands. You can go back to lots of brands over the years that have, Wendy's is a great example of social media brand that has fun with people. And what does that do to build trust? So I guess I'm wondering, Ryan, if you have any kind of examples. There's that one maybe across Canada or internally or some way in which you said, like, these are just examples of how school districts are just being a little bit playful and sort of ripping off the mask of like, we'll just tell you when school ends and starts, when the snow day is, and all of those things, to being a
Yeah.
little bit more human, if you will.
Yeah, there are so many examples across the country that I would be remiss to call it a few, but I know just at a high level there are several school districts, who are implementing student journalists as like on the ground reporters and capturing that on video to add that human element and provide a face to the brand a little bit. There are school districts using animated characters to create a bit of a personality and some playfulness to it. I think back just to your comment on Peel is, there was a time where Peel was ranked top 10 Twitter feeds in Canada amongst some of the larger corporate brands who had big teams behind it. And meanwhile, Peel, we had a 4 or 5 communications professionals serving the second largest school district in the country. And so to have that was, a fun honor to acknowledge the work. And we always saw our biggest follower increases the night of a snow day because of the anticipation. But
Right.
I think
Sure.
there is a lot of credit that needs to be, well recognized there is there, even though it was through this digital platform and we didn't identify the person or people behind the account, that was part of the fun of people trying to identify who is the messenger behind this account. And people
Sure.
knew the communications department was behind it, but they didn't know necessarily the specific person. And, even in that, the tone changed a little bit because people had different involvements. And so we
Right.
kind of kept the guesswork in motion there a little bit, which was part of the fun. But ultimately, I think what I think that says, that period of time of playfulness around inclement weather days, even though it's a very serious communication, whether schools are open or closed and buses are running and the safety of student and staff getting to school safely, it's a very important message. But I think what it said is people knew they could trust us to provide updates in a timely and efficient manner when we said we were going to. And so, what used to be the website or the radio or the morning breakfast TV station, we quickly were able to shift it to the Twitter feed because it was immediate in the moment, and we followed up on our commitment as to what we said we were going to do. And then we just added some, pop culture flavor to it. And it took a life of its own, and it was fun. I'd also want to acknowledge it was a lot of work, a lot of late evenings and early mornings that, sometimes goes unnoticed. But I think what that really did is that social media feed really was a springboard for a lot of school districts across the country and North America, I think, to say this is a different way of delivering communications in the public sector, which is very, maybe to your earlier comment, of sterile and corporate, right? So here's a good example of doing things differently to create engagement, to build trust, and to build relationships. And so we're seeing the ripple effects, in my opinion, today through digital communication channels. And as I said, whether it's a student reporter or, through a little bit more screen time of putting a face to the brand, I think you're seeing school districts really utilize the digital channels, not just social media, but digital channels
Sure.
to for its benefit in various ways. So
Well,
yeah.
and yeah, and it's the other part about that story, I think, is the larger the school district, the less human it can be, right? I mean, I think of TDSB, I think of Peel, like these are massive
Yes.
corporations versus
20,000 employees,
yeah,
150,000 students across
right?
3 municipalities. It's a massive
I
organization.
remember asking at the time John Malloy, who was the director at TDSB, with 500 and I don't know what they have, 49 schools. I said, "Can you even name all the schools?" He says, "No, I can't." So like versus, a small prairie, rural,
Yeah.
northern Ontario community of, maybe 5,000 students where they know the names of everybody. So the opportunity for them to be human, to have relationship capital is far
Yep.
easier than it is. And so, like I think all of that is factored in terms of like how you, like the degree to which you are highly risk averse because of the potential damage that can be done, but also the degree to which you're trying to show the humanity of what is a purely human organization. That's what teaching and learning is. And so I think I'm as you're sharing, Ryan, I'm hearing the complexity of the rules. Like it's highly complex. I love the fact that you've called out earlier sort of the difference between strategical and tactical kinds of approaches. And I think I think it's maybe something that I don't know that even the average educator who are, inside the organization, never mind people outside of it, truly can appreciate.
Yeah. And I think our role also plays another role where, we kind of, because we sit centrally at the board office, we work with so many departments and individuals on a daily basis on so many different projects. We kind of start to see the organization at a very macro perspective, and we kind of have intel in a lot of spaces. And I think when you bring that kind of high level strategic leadership knowledge down through your department to whoever's leading, social media or other aspects of communication, is, it also allowed us, whether it was email or social media or other digital tools, it really allowed us to provide customer service to our stakeholders in a different format, instead of them visiting the board office or visiting the school main office or picking up the phone, right? We were able to almost in real time, with some expectations, provide a response to an event that is happening, to a challenge that might be happening at a school, to something that might be happening in the community. And so really the other element that's often missed is the customer service piece. And I think that has evolved as part of our role, and the tools have helped evolve that in different ways, in a positive way too.
Yeah. So let me just ask you about the tools a little bit. So, you and I are old school. We use the word Twitter. And that's a classic example of a platform that at one time was, when we talked about social media, that's what we were talking about by and large. Yes, there's Facebook and other places, but that's where it was. Well, that in itself has shifted. I don't even know how many schools are even continuing to use X to whatever degree. So I guess my question is around, how do you sort of determine, because now arguably TikTok might be the most popular social media space. Again, depends on your audience and demographics and those kind of things. But like, how do you make the determination in terms of which channels you think you need to be in? And then I'll add to that question, what role maybe AI plays, thinking of AI not necessarily as a platform, but also as part of, a digital opportunity, i.e. risk that has to be considered. So I guess just thinking about whether it's the future, like, hey, should we explore or be in this space? Should we not be in this space? Like, how do you kind of think through that? And then again, just adding that component of AI to that.
I don't want to disappoint people and think that I'm going to give some very intelligent answer, that there's a strategy and, there's months of research that goes into everything. I know as an APR accredited person, research is important and strategy is important and stuff like that. But I just, based on the constant evolving landscape of social media, some of these things do happen in the moment. Obviously you're doing your due diligence and stuff like that, but there is no necessarily formula to determine whether it's the right or wrong space, in my opinion. And I think, when I joined Grant Erie 2 years ago, we were still on Twitter. It was probably our number one tool. But, when you bring things back in everything you do, whether it's tools of being social media or other pieces of your work, back to metrics and analytics and trying to understand your audience, and you ask yourself and ask your department, are we getting the ROI, not so much the return on investment, but the return on the output of your human resources to do that work. And when you look back, years ago, whether you're a small district or one of the larger school districts, when you were getting, dozens or hundreds of likes and engagements on Twitter, that was pretty positive, right? And that was reinforcing that was the right space you should be on, and better than Facebook and Instagram and all of those other tools. But when you see those numbers quickly dwindle down to a post that's not even getting a single like or engagement, like I think that should just be really telling to maybe this isn't the space for you. And so I think it's always important, my part of my philosophy is like on an annual basis, you at least an annual basis, you take a step back and you reevaluate what you're doing and the tools you're using. And so, we did that. We still have an official Twitter account primarily to hold the name so no one can compromise and use it. We use it for monitoring purposes because, news outlets are still on it, or you still might have some community members on it. So I think from a monitoring perspective, but we haven't posted on it in about 18 months. So then you
Right.
take a step back and you look at your audiences and where your parents are and
Yeah.
your other stakeholders, and you start to realize like, wow, Facebook is actually still a very heavily used platform and very
Sure.
influential in the communities with all of these micro communities popping up. You have an opportunity to be active, to be proactive and share positive news stories, but also go on there and correct misinformation. So that has really been a focus for us. Instagram as well, from a more visual positive perspective. The other big piece, again, we're not heavily pushing on it, but more from a misinformation, because that is a huge challenge that we're dealing with, I think, as a society, not just communications professionals, but the misinformation out there or disinformation is Reddit. And so the use of Reddit and understanding what your community is saying or thinking about you, about the decisions you make around the board table, they're quickly discussed on Reddit. If there's an incident at a school, last week we had a lockdown at a secondary school, affected a few elementary schools as well. Reddit was the first place where that information popped up. And so you're able to go and correct, the rumor mill, which I think is a big,
So you're necessarily not necessarily posting to Reddit, but you're interacting on Reddit?
yeah, because I'm of the belief with Reddit, and again, I'm not saying there's a strategy and I'm right or wrong, but when I
Yeah.
think posting as the organization on Reddit, it just looks like the PR mill, like you're just pumping out your stuff. And
Right.
that can be said
Yeah.
for other platforms too, but just
Sure.
knowing
Sure.
the users of Reddit, they're a bit of a different audience, and they read into that very quickly. And so the posting we do is primarily to engage in someone else's conversation, to correct information or provide updates on
Right.
a school incident and stuff like that, that we then know will penetrate and have a ripple effect out into the community. So yeah,
And just the fact that you're commenting, I think lets people know that, like, because some people might be thinking of it as a subversive place to, like, oh, we can talk badly about a
well,
place. It's like, actually, we're watching you, so you can't say anything super salacious because we would probably say, yeah, you're actually wrong on that. So like that's
yeah,
an interesting, probably, like, again, it's reactive, but at the same time proactive in the sense that you're trying to squash any kind of weird misinformation before it gets too far down the road. And
yeah, and
so,
I
yeah,
think it's
it's
like an old
interesting.
lesson. I'll, like just back to Carla and even Brian Woodland at the Peel District School. Like one of the things I, learned from them in the early days is like, if you're not in those spaces and engaging or monitoring those spaces, someone else will for you, right?
Right.
And so if you want your, back to the brand reputation, back to messaging and all of those pieces, if you want it to be factual and professional, you should be in those spaces in some way or another. And so
Yeah.
sometimes it's heavily engaged and pushing message. Sometimes it's reactive and monitoring and kind of just responding. And I think, so just you had another question in there kind of about how do you determine, I think it's, new channels are popping up all the time. You kind of, my belief is when a new channel pops up, create an account, establish your presence so you could secure your brand, like your handle or whatever it is. So you at least have that if in fact you do decide to go down that avenue. But I think step one is to just establish an account so you kind of hold those credentials. But I think I am of the belief that you kind of sit back in the dark a little bit and just monitor and see what happens and transpires over, 60, 90 days. And I think a good example of that was, when the ownership of Twitter or X was turned over, and then this thing Threads, popped up, and everyone thought Threads was going to be like the new Twitter. And it really hasn't, right? But everyone jumped
Yeah.
on Threads and started investing time and resources on it. And I don't think they've gotten the ROI. So I think taking that kind of waiting period a little bit and just, watching and kind of active listening, good old practice skills of active
Sure.
listening, I think helps that strategy and influences your decision making. Things like TikTok we've explored and I'm very intrigued in it. And I think it could be a good platform, but I think, it requires another level of resourcing. Often
Yeah,
effective TikToks
that's right.
require person on camera, and
Yeah.
that requires a lot of back end work to hire
Right.
or have someone in place and do all of that work. So from a
Right.
resourcing perspective, it hasn't worked out for us for a
Mhm.
number of reasons. And then us also trying to figure out, does TikTok have a place in the Canadian landscape? Is it banned? Is it allowed? All of those pieces play
That's
play a
right.
factor in it as well. So I think you also had something in there about AI. I don't know
Yeah,
if you want me to touch on that as
sure.
well, but I think, AI, I mean, it's honestly a huge conversation that we could have and probably talk about it in very micro perspectives for probably 60 minutes alone. But I think, let's be honest, we all know AI is here. It's here to stay. It's going to change the way we, work and live and play. But I think there are, from a communications perspective, there's a lot of positives that are coming from it around efficiency and stuff like that. But I think there are some negatives around, I think about, even my journey into this career. I think about, the entry level. I got my start in Peel in 2012 or 2011, I guess, as a communications assistant. Like that role and the role that I did there, like some of the functions are now being replaced by AI, and
Right.
it's harder to get that start going from school and into the industry. So I give that a lot of thought. But in terms of using AI as a tool, I think about just day to day our work uh, uh, as a communications department, how we can be more efficient. Things like back to my earlier comment around the use of social media from a customer service perspective. I think there's a lot of good and bad stories around using kind of AI agents on your website to offer customer service. So I think we're really starting to like explore and see what that could look like from a kind of a customer service communication strategy as a tool as we move forward. And don't have any timelines on it, but I
Yeah.
think AI, I think it's here. I think we just need to look at it. I think AI in this role, because one of our primary audiences is students, and for the most part all of our students are under the age of 18, which for the most part is considered a minor, and photo permissions and privacy considerations. And I think being a huge challenge of this work and how it will evolve, and will be very fascinated in the next few months, is the use of student photography and stuff like that with the world of AI, and how it's taking and manipulating and doing not so good things with AI generated multimedia. And I think that's a huge challenge that we need to just like sit back and unpack and reevaluate a little bit in this communications world. So
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And again, the challenge, the biggest challenge is like it's difficult in your role to really experiment like with this, right? Like because like the risks are pretty great. And so like I think that's the challenge you face is like we'd like to use it. We see the potential, but like, to your point, like the idea of using images or whatever, and the risks might be pretty great at the moment too, right? In terms of like,
yeah,
yeah,
there isn't a testing playground available
right.
necessarily. And I think you have to be mindful around, the equity and diversity and inclusion aspect of
Well,
of,
yeah,
of
there's a
things,
bunch of these features.
a
Yeah.
bunch of things, right? So, and I think I don't know about you, but I think there is still the aspect around the authenticity, right? I see a lot of benefits with AI generated content, but if you're trying to tell a story, does it pull at the heartstrings the same way
That's right.
and create that human connection and build trust and build a relationship as kind of some of the quote unquote more traditional
right?
processes allowed you to do. So
Well, and there's some things that, again, this is where it's so nuanced, it's so specific, right? Like if you can create an AI generated bot that will actually accurately post snow days and give out that information, people aren't looking for a human connection. They just want to know the thing, right?
yeah.
But then there's other communications that, to your point, we want it to pull at the heartstrings. So like it's again, to
Yeah.
make blanket statements about it. That's where that again, I'm sort of layering in my own little
No,
soapbox here around. To make very broad statements is challenging because you need to be specific when you're talking about, like,
totally.
even when you say AI, like some people are thinking about very different things when
Oh,
when you say that word, right? So at any rate, but that we'll leave that for another. I
we'll
got
save
one more
that for another
question, then we'll hit you
podcast.
some
Yeah.
quick ones.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you could just, if you think back to your career and you think of like
Yeah.
your greatest story of success by whatever metric you want to have. So whether it was like, oh, I can tell you the data why this was successful, or it just like this was a hard thing that we were able to do. Like, what's your kind of, the story that you would share of like what you would say was your great. I mean, I don't know. You're applying for another job and you're trying to tell somebody, oh, here's a thing I was involved in that went really well. Like, what's that story?
Yeah, I think for me, I'll be honest, it comes to mind so easily at the end just because I used it. It's about 10 years ago that it happened. But I think it just, for me, the role, in my career, I've left school communications a couple times. I've gone to the municipality world, I've gone to the private sector, I've gone to the nonprofit world, but I've always come back. And I really believe in public education. I love the role the communicators can play in public education. Every day is a new day. And I think what it sometimes ultimately comes back to is, you know, building relationships internally with staff, you're both centrally and at the school level, getting to know students. There have been situations where you see a student, you do a story on them because they've done something incredible in grade one, and then 7 years later, you're featuring that same student graduating grade eight. It's kind of to see that growth there's nothing like it. And I'm sure someone would argue and say in other sectors, has its moments as well. But for me, I think this role supporting the front lines and being a storyteller of the incredible things that are happening inside schools every day is nothing beats it. And I think for me, one thing that really sticks out that I had a fairly significant role in, but it would not have been possible with several other staff, was about 10 years ago, Canada welcomed, a significant number of Syrian newcomers into Canada. And it was kind of very sudden. It was actually in Peel at the time. It happened about the largest population of Syrian newcomers happened about 2 weeks before March break in Ontario, or spring break, as others might call it. And so for us, not only were these families trying to find a place to live, they were trying to figure out which school to attend. They might have been trying to figure out clothing because of our changing seasons. These families had a lot on their plate as they were coming into a new place. And then we, throw up a roadblock and say, oh, by the way, in about 2 weeks' time, after you've registered your child for school, you're going to actually be at home with your child for an entire week because schools are closed. And so this allowed us in Peel, we had an incredible opportunity where we had 4 outdoor education centers, and one of them was home to a sugar shack and maple syrup, quite an expansive maple syrup space. And they would often host tours. And so we had the opportunity to bring about, I think, upwards of 300 Syrian newcomer families. So the student registered in our system, and also their parent or caregiver. We were able to provide them transportation up to the sugar shack, give them an entire day of like the ultimate Canadian experience come kind of that winter season. And I think, we were able to do some very traditional. We invited the Toronto Star on the trip, so they followed and interviewed. We had a video team. We captured it all on video. So we did a very traditional and kind of comprehensive communications plan. We pulled it off in about 72 hours, from everything from booking buses to media to organization of the entire event. And, and the feedback from those families was incredible. Like it was one of the best experiences of their life. It was the most welcoming moment of their kind of journey into Canada and stuff like that. And I had since left the district, and there was a moment, I guess, at a commencement where one of these students went on through high school and graduated and shared that experience at their commencement speech. And so to hear that through the grapevines
Yeah.
so many years later kind of just reinforced how maybe those non-classroom experiential learning opportunities, things that don't, as I said earlier, have a strategic communications plan attached to it that required a lot of research or development, that it was a very spontaneous in the moment, but the right thing to do for that audience and group of individuals has provided a lasting impact on me. And from what I hear, has obviously had some impact on those families who participated. And I know as a district, it made us feel proud of who we were as an organization and what we were able to offer those families. So just reinforcing that ability of storytelling, the frontline work of outdoor education, of the staff, what they do every day, even outside of classroom, those staff were still working on the March break to offer extracurricular programming. Like we were able to multi-prong the story and the messaging to really deliver a very fulsome experience. And I thought that was very validating for our work as communications professionals. And, just one example of many, but it's something I often come back to because it shows, I think how what I didn't reference this earlier, but I do think a lot of us are kind of jack of all trades. We don't specialize in one area of communications. And so it showed the kind of the ability and the importance of the communications professional role within a school district in that moment. So.
Oh, that's awesome. Great story. All right. That's good one to sort of wrap up the main part of our conversation. I'm going to hit you with three quick ones to end here. All right. What are you reading?
2 books at the moment. We're reading Inside the Box, How Constraints Make Us Better by David Epstein, different Epstein, but it's about how sometimes working within the sandbox can be more effective than full control. I just also picked up for also hopefully for a purpose of case, but Democracy's Second Act from Peter McLeod, and just how the role of public in politics is playing. So those are 2 pieces. And then the one thing you didn't ask me this, but I will just give a gentle plug. Case also has its own podcast, and we'll have to get you on their Dean, but it's called Case Connects. And we just recently released a new episode with Jay Robb, who's the manager of communications from McMaster University in Hamilton, kind of all about storytelling. So that's
Nice.
a great listen as well. So
good for you guys. All right. And what are you watching?
Off air, I give you the background, but I'll share it with the audience. Is unless I'm out with friends, nothing. We took down the TV as parents for some parenting strategies. Maybe I don't know if it's working or not, but our 5-year-old needed a pause from TV, so the TV physically came off the wall. So we have all not been watching things, but when I'm out with some friends, I've been watching, including last night. I don't know when this is going to air, but game 1 of the Eastern Conference Final in the NHL, where the only Canadian team left, Montreal Canadiens, had a nice 6-2 win there last night. So Montreal.
Yes. Well, and if you're just looking for sports, there's always a sports bar somewhere.
That's true.
Sure.
That's true.
Reach that you can find if you need that fix. So I appreciate that. My last question is, and so again, you can talk about Brantford, you can talk about Hamilton, whatever you want, but always looking for a hidden gem. So what's the place? It could be a restaurant, it could be a park, it could be a museum, it could be anything that's like, I don't think a lot of people know about this, but there's kind of and again, maybe it's like I said, maybe it's a favorite restaurant. So what's the hidden gem in your area?
I mean, so from restaurants, I'm a huge Hamilton fan. So the Hamilton has a reputation, but it continues to get a glowing reputation for restaurant. The restaurant scene downtown is incredible. There are so many places to mention. So I highly recommend folks visiting Hamilton to check out a lot of the great restaurants. Parks in Hamilton I love in the summertime, like Bayfront Park down by the water. Gage Park is beautiful. And in Brantford, where I get the opportunity to work, the Sanderson Center, which is a theater in downtown Brantford, has a lot of great performances and shows throughout the year. They're huge, as I mentioned, a huge sports guy. So the Brantford Bulldogs, which is great hockey. And also, we do a lot of professional learning, which is the Woodland Cultural Center, which is the site of a residential school, a former residential school that has been turned into a museum and cultural center for the public and for organizations to visit and learn. And I think it's for those who I think everyone should visit it at some point in time. It's quite an eye-opening experience, quite humbling and very informative around the experience. So Woodland Cultural Center as a museum in Brantford is amazing.
Fantastic. Well, that's lots to
That's lots.
explore.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Ryan, it was great to reconnect.
Likewise.
Again, I
Yeah.
appreciate the role that you serve and all of those people across. I've gotten to know a lot of great communications people in schools across Canada, and I think just highlighting the significance, the importance, the complexity, and the value of that role is something I think Case is doing and you're doing. And so, all the best. Thanks for your time today.
Thanks, Dean. This was a blast. Talk soon.